We're continuing our focus on Black History Month here at Gospel Tangents. I'd like to introduce our next guest, Dr. Newell Bringhurst. He's been writing on Mormon history topics since the 1970s and has written on a variety of topics. Today we'll talk about his first book ever published, Saints, Slaves, and Blacks. I think you'll find it very interesting. Before you do that, I just want to mention that we're continuing our Black History Month sale. We've got Darren Smith and Dr. Paul Reeve on sale. And also, since we've just finished Russell Stevenson, that should be out this week. So if you've already subscribed, I should be sending that out to you in the next day or so. You can get a free PDF copy for subscribing for just $10 a month. So please do that. You'll get the latest transcripts before anyone else. So that'll be a real bonus. Now back to our conversation. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents podcast. I'm really excited to have a wonderful historian, Newell Bringhurst, here on the show today. So thank you, Newell, for taking some time here.
Well, it's my pleasure.
All right. So Newell Bringhurst, why don't you give us a little bit of background on kind of your academic history? And I know you've recently retired, but where did you teach before that, and where did you get your PhD?
Well, I started my academic career at the University of Utah. I did both bachelor's and master's in history at the University of Utah in the mid-'60s. And then I went to California and did graduate work for a PhD at the University of California, Davis. And that I completed my doctoral dissertation, which became the basis for my first book, Saints, Slaves, and Blacks, and completed the dissertation in 1975. And then I revised it and updated it because, see, it was published. The dissertation was finished 3 years before the Black Revelation in 1978. And so that, of course, required some major revision, particularly in the later chapters. And so I spent the next 5 years revising and updating the dissertation, and it was published in 1981 under the title of Saints, Slaves, and Blacks, the Changing Place of Black People Within Mormonism.
Yeah, so it's a great book. I think I even paid $20 for it. I think we were talking yesterday. I think you said it was $30 brand new, and I bought it 20, 30 years later, and it was still $20. So it's quite holding its value.
Well, I've seen editions of it for as much as $75 to $100 for ones that are in mint condition. I think Kurt Bench had one over he'd gotten from a private collection, and it had been autographed by me. It was an autographed copy. It looked like it was in mint condition, and he was asking $75 for it.
Yeah. So it's a great book. I understand you're I shouldn't say already because it's been out a long time, but you're working on a second edition with Colford Books.
Yes, it's going to be published as an updated, expanded version. I'm going to virtually leave the text as I wrote it originally, because I feel like number one, I feel like it's stood up pretty good with the test of time as far as my basic thesis and the way that my overarching interpretation. But I'm going to add an introduction for the second edition, which will kind of be a historiographical discussion of where I fit into the scholarship as it evolved from those who preceded me in writing on the Black issue and those who have written on the same issue since 1981, because there's been a whole body of literature and the historical inquiry has moved in directions beyond what I did in Saints, Slaves, and Blacks. But as far as what I did with that book, focusing on the treatment of blacks within the church, focusing on black priesthood denial and the lifting of the ban, I feel that that's held up pretty well. And it'll also include a kind of an addendum, a final chapter, which will actually be a reprint of an article that was published in Sunstone they did a 25th anniversary issue of Sunstone, and they asked me to reflect on the processes and the obstacles that I overcame in writing Slaves and Blacks earlier, and so that'll kind of tell people a little bit how the book evolved and how it was written. Mm-hmm. And that's not in the original version.
Okay. Now, where did you used to teach before you retired?
Well, I've taught at 4 or 5 different institutions. My full-time teaching career actually started at San Jose State. I taught there from 1972 to 75. And that was the toughest part of my academic career, because I was in the process, I finishing up the dissertation and teaching full-time for the first time. And sort of like going through basic training in the Army is something that it's one of those experiences that tests you and that you wouldn't want to go through again, but it was a good learning experience. And then I went on from there, taught 1 year at Boise State University. The first 2 positions were sabbatical replacement positions, so there was no tenured position that was offered. And so at San Jose State, they initially offered me a 1 year position, and then somebody else went on sabbatical the second year, so they offered me a 2nd year position. Third person went off on sabbatical on it, and the 3rd year, and so they offered me a 3rd year appointment, but they could never offer me tenure because there wasn't a tenure position available. And after the 3rd year, number one, nobody went on sabbatical again, and number 2, if they'd offered me a 3rd year, they would have had to put me on a tenure track, and they couldn't do that because there weren't any tenure track positions. So I was scraping around for another position, and I got the 1 year teaching position at Boise State. And but again, it was only a sabbatical replacement position. So finally, I got a tenure track position at Indiana University at Kokomo, a regional campus and that took us to the Midwest, which was a little bit of a culture shock. It was a lot different than California, a lot different than Idaho. No mountains there, flat, harsh winters. I started teaching in the middle of the year, and it was 2 weeks after we got there. It was January. We had a blizzard 2 weeks after we got there, and my wife says, "Oh, I don't think I'm going to like this place." But we put up with it for 4.5 years. And so I searched for a way to get back to the West. And I took my 4th and final position, teaching position, which I was at for 25 years, was at College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California. It's near the Sequoia National Park. That's where it gets the name, College of the Sequoias, and close to Yosemite. And it was an ideal situation as far as being back in California and being just the environment we wanted to live in. And it paid very well. I mean, even though it was a step down from teaching at a 4-year school, I was teaching at a 2-year school, but the salary was considerably higher than it had been in Indiana. And so it was a heavier teaching load. I had to teach 5 classes a semester, and but they expected you'd be focusing most of your attention on teaching, but I still had this desire and this urge to do research and writing. And so the writing and research study was basically on my own time, although they did grant me 2 sabbaticals to complete 2 of the books that I was working on. So I was fortunate in that regard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, so the reason why I wanted to talk to you was for that book that you talked about, Saints, Slaves, and Blacks. Although before we get into that, let's talk about some of the other books that you've written. I know there's another one with Darren Smith. If you want to talk about that. Darren Smith and I did
a second book that I was involved with on blacks, and that was the Blacks and Mormonism, published by University of Illinois Press, and it was basically an anthology. We gathered together a group of writers And it focused on, basically it focuses on developments within the church in the wake of the 1978 revelation. We recruited a group of scholars that included people like Darius Gray. He's got a well-known African-American black. Darren Smith wrote an essay for it on unpacking racism within the Mormon Church. Armin Moss contributed an essay to the volume. And so we were able to get a number of people. We got a fellow by the name of Alma Allred, and he, University of Utah, he's related to actually the Allreds that are associated with the Apostolic United Brethren. Although he's a stalwart Latter-day Saint, he wrote an essay, a perspective on race, and based on, I guess, the experiences he had with people in his own family, because the fundamentalist Mormons, they consider the 78 revelation as one more indication of the heresy or the wrong path taken by the mainline LDS Church, along with the fact they abandoned polygamy and that. And so in a way, he was writing an essay to try to answer their arguments and their concerns. One of the more interesting essays in the volume. And I did an essay actually looking at the historiographical development of the so-called Missouri thesis, how that was originally used to try to explain that Joseph Smith started the policy, and of course it became a central tenet of not only Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, but also of Stephen Taggart's little book that Lester Bush ultimately critiqued and pretty well discounted. But so I did an essay kind of dealing with the dynamics with regard to the Missouri thesis, the so-called Missouri thesis. And so it was a smaller book, but it dealt with issues and concerns in the wake of the 78 revelation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great book. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Newell Bringhurst. In our next conversation, we'll continue to talk more about the Missouri thesis, and we'll talk about Lester Bush's groundbreaking 1973 article.
And then, of course, Bush comes along 4 years later with his, definitive dialogue article, Mormonism's Negro Policy. That is the classic, the first real, what I consider the legitimately scholarly examination of the issue, the path-breaking article that we all, those of us that came after him, owe him a lot for.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.